Y'all, good afternoon. We have a special treat this afternoon. We're going to hear Boettcher from the Birmingham Museum of Art. He'll be introduced in just a minute, but I wanted to welcome you all to this lecture this afternoon. We're glad you're here, and we'll look forward to hearing from Graham.
Thank you.
And I'm gonna use the microphone so y'all can hear me. It's my great pleasure to introduce Graham Boettcher, who is the Hugh Daniel Director of the Birmingham Museum of Art. Graham is a native of Bellingham, Washington. He received his BA and PhD from Yale University and an MA from the University of Washington. He has been in Birmingham for over 15 years, having held various positions, starting as a curatorial fellow in American art, and then ascending to chief curator, deputy director, and now director. He has put on numerous exhibitions, including the Look of Love eye miniatures exhibition, which you might remember some years back came here to this museum. And I can also attest that among Graham's many interests, he is a wonderful collector and has a delightful singing voice. He is currently working on a Viking Revival exhibition. His interests are wide-ranging, and he's a fascinating speaker, so I'd love for you to welcome Graham Boettcher to the stage.
Thank you, Akela. Yes, Akela and I spent a summer together in Giverny as fellows of the Terra Foundation for American Art. It was their inaugural year of their summer fellowship, where I think we were doing a lot of things other than being serious about our research, if I'm being honest, but we had long meals followed by impromptu concerts. So Akela has heard me sing, though I promise not to inflict that upon you all today. So it is a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Akela for inviting me to speak here today, and thank Bill Island for hosting me here at GMOA. This is a topic which has been a work in progress, and I want to give you a little bit of background just before we dig in. When I became director at the Birmingham Museum of Art, which has been now 2.5 years ago, one of the things that I wanted to do straight out of the gate is be very upfront about the museum's history. Birmingham has, as much as museums today talk about being inclusive, talking about being community responsive, Birmingham, by design, was not always that way in its history. In fact, it began its history in 1951 by excluding a sizable portion of the community from regular access to the museum. So I think in order to kind of move into the future, one has to acknowledge and address the past. And the past is very real in Birmingham, Alabama. How many of you have been to Birmingham? Please raise your hands. Nearly everyone in the room. The past is present in Birmingham. It's around every corner. You drive by the 16th Street Baptist Church. You drive by Kelly Ingram Park. Even the museum that you see on the screen here where I work every day is across from Lynn Park, which was the site of one of the earliest lynchings in Birmingham's history. So the ghosts of history are everywhere and very present. But sometimes people don't like to talk about things that are uncomfortable. I would say that's often the case. And these are ugly truths about Birmingham's past. But I think, like I said, it's important to acknowledge them. And so in some of the earliest interviews that I gave when I became director, and reporters asked me, well, what do you want to achieve for the museum? I said, what I want to achieve most is that people feel a sense of belonging, that they feel that they own this museum. We have no barriers to admission, no barriers to entrance in terms of admission. We are one of the few museums of our size in the country that are free. And so you can walk right in and enjoy it. We're open 6 days a week. But still, because of the legacy of its history, there are people in the Birmingham community and their descendants that have never felt that sense of ownership, have never felt like the museum was theirs for the taking. Didn't think the museum was for them because in its earliest years, the museum said it wasn't, and it stuck. And it was a painful message, and one that, despite the fact that things have changed legally and I think ethically, for us, that those wounds have not yet healed. And so I think a logical step is to acknowledge them and talk about them openly. That led to my being invited to participate in a blog. There's a somewhat popular blog in Birmingham called Comeback Town that is the work of a gentleman named David Scher. David tackles a lot of issues dealing with city governance and kind of progress in the Birmingham community. It's a real booster for our city and trying to move us forward. And he said, well, Graham is director of the museum. Would you like to participate and write a guest blog? And no rules. You can write about whatever you want. And I said, well, I've never really had the chance to have a forum to talk about the museum's history. In the legacy of Jim Crow and how that created perceptions that are still enduring today. So I participated, wrote the guest blog. It was published on AL.com, Alabama.com, which is the kind of online branch of the Birmingham News. I unfortunately ignored the advice that everyone says don't read the comments section. There were some hateful comments, as you might imagine, but also some really positive ones, and people who kind of acknowledged the importance of being candid about the past in the present. That led to a phone call from some folks in Oklahoma who have a podcast called Museum Confidential. They read the blog and asked if I would participate in their podcast talking about this issue. They'd never heard a museum director speak openly about this type of history, and were interested in capturing that. And then I think that brings us here today. I think, Kelli, you saw maybe both the blog and the podcast and decided that this is something that would have a forum here at the University of Georgia. So with that, I chose this image for a very particular reason. This is a report issued by the Birmingham Comptroller in 1959 entitled The 1959 Municipal Tax Dollar, exciting title, and it features the Birmingham Museum of Art on its cover because this was the very year that our current building opened. By that point, the Birmingham Museum of Art was 8 years old. It had been operating out of galleries in City Hall, but thanks to a $1 million bequest from Mrs. Oscar Wells, the wife of a prominent banker, this building was built and opened to great fanfare in 1959. If you go back, some of you may recognize this individual or certainly recognize the name. This is Eugene Bull Connor, who was the City of Birmingham's Commissioner of Public Safety for 2 separate stints, arguably the single most powerful man in Birmingham during his period in office. He controlled the police, and he very famously told a reporter in 1958, damn the law, we don't give a damn about the law. Down here, we make our own law. So that sets the scene, and you'll see on this report whose name appears right below the mayor to the left, Eugene Bull Connor. The city at that time had a mayor and commissioner system that would eventually change, and I'll speak about that in just a moment. But Bull Connor, though he was not the mayor, as Commissioner of Public Safety, his presence loomed large in the Magic City, or under his tenure, one might call it more appropriately, the Tragic City, a nickname which it received and has stuck, sadly. Still, that moniker gets dragged out like I said, we live with the scars of our history. When this report was published in 1959, and I apologize, you can't quite see the writing on the screen, but I'll describe. Birmingham touted in this report all of its various amenities. It touted the brand new museum built at a cost of $1.3 million. It touted the annual attendance of the museum, which drew tens of thousands of people in its opening months. It also touted, though, the fact that its facilities were separate. And it listed the fact that it said, quote, Birmingham maintains a library system comprised of 11 libraries for whites and 3 for Negroes, all free. Well, as we know, separate is not equal. If you analyze this against the data from the 1960 U.S. Census, and I decided to use the 1960 U.S. Census rather than the 1959, so approximately the same. This is the statistical breakdown of the population by race. They're 60% white and 39.6% black. If separate were equal, at least in terms of the number of libraries, there should have been 6 libraries for blacks instead of just 3. The way that Birmingham divided its resources with respect to the museum was even less equal. Blacks were only admitted to enter the museum, permitted to enter the museum 1 day a week. Tuesday, which I have seen referred to as Negro Day or Colored Day. It is not entirely clear to me, and perhaps greater research will reveal this, how this was enforced in terms of did it apply to all non-whites? Was the guard serving as the arbiter of who was light enough to pass? Curiously, the first director's wife proudly declared that she was Native American and exhibited as a Native American artist. She was certainly in attendance at all museum events. So from what I can tell, it seems primarily directed at Birmingham's African American population rather than other non-white populations in the city. I want to recount for you a specific incident that happened probably in the early 60s, and I heard it directly from Dr. David Driscoll, preeminent artist and scholar of African American art, who used to serve one of his earliest positions in education as an assistant professor of art at Talladega College from 1955 to 1962. Several years ago, when Dr. Driscoll was being honored at our museum, when he took the stage, he told a story about when he brought a group of his students from Talladega College to Birmingham. And he, on the ride over, waxed about the beautiful things that they would see in the Crest collection of Italian Renaissance art. He was very, very excited to be able to show his students masterpieces firsthand, things that they had been talking about in class but had not yet had the opportunity to see. Unfortunately, the field trip was not on the designated day. It was not on a Tuesday. And as Dr. Driscoll recounted, when he arrived and walked in with his students, the white guard, these may be my words, not his, got a little paler, and was just, oh my gosh, what do I do? He called the director, and the director on the right, Richard Howard, who was a Harvard-educated monuments man. He was head of the Monuments Recovery Division at the end of the Second World War for a time. He came down and politely asked Dr. Driscoll and his students to leave and said that if they would come back on Tuesday, he would give them a personal tour. I will speculate in a moment on Richard Howard. Unfortunately, Richard Howard never left any written memoirs. to talk about his own thoughts. He served for director for quite some time, a quarter century, 1951 to 1976. He saw a lot of change during that time, but so far as I've been able to find thus far, he never committed any thoughts to paper about that period and about his own thoughts on the segregation ordinances that he had to operate under as the museum's first director. We'll say more on Dr. Driscoll in just a moment, except I do want to add that the irony of the fact that Dr. Driscoll was on stage, more than 40 years later, being honored by the very same museum that turned him away at the doors, that wasn't lost on anyone. It was a very poignant moment. So, at the Birmingham Museum of Art, you might be able to guess that if blacks were not being allowed to visit more than one day a week, their work probably wasn't being shown at the museum. The museum did show African art, but the work of African American artists was not being shown. That would eventually change, as I'll describe in just a moment. But I don't want to convey the false impression that there was a void of exhibition opportunities for African American artists in Birmingham. Quite the contrary, there was a vibrant scene, as so many African American leaders had done in Birmingham and elsewhere in the Jim Crow South. When they were denied opportunities, they created their own opportunities. When businesses were not available to them, they started their own businesses. And that was the same of the Birmingham Art Scene. There were a number of art organizations that were founded mostly by women, by black women in Birmingham, to bring in nationally recognized African American artists. This is one example. The work of Haywood Oubre was shown in Birmingham in 1962. The exhibition was not held at the Birmingham Museum of Art, but rather at L.R. Hall Auditorium in the A.G. Gaston building. Some of you recognize the name of A.G. Gaston, a major figure in the civil rights movement, Alabama's first black millionaire, made a fortune in many business endeavors, insurance being one of the largest. And his building was the site, and his motel were the site of many civil rights leader meetings, including meetings with Martin Luther King and Fred Shuttlesworth. In this article that appeared in the Huntsville Mirror in May of '62, it mentions that many notables who are considered as art critics, such as Mrs. David Roberts III, M. Howard, director of the Birmingham Museum of Art, made expressions in the following terms: "The exhibit is magnificent." So I think it's interesting to note that Richard Howard, the museum's director, was attending these exhibitions of black artists organized by black art clubs in Birmingham. It's also interesting to note that Mrs. David Roberts, Mrs. David Roberts, her first name is Cecil. She was an English woman who moved to Birmingham, and Cecil Roberts is acknowledged widely. In fact, this fact appeared in her 1990 obituary in the New York Times as the woman who did much to integrate the arts in Birmingham. She and her husband invited a black civil rights leader and his wife to attend the Birmingham Symphony with them, and walked right into the auditorium alongside them, and as you might imagine, were ostracized for making such a bold statement. But at the end of the day, Cecil Roberts lived long enough to be acknowledged for being an ally in that struggle. So in 1963, and I have to say, I don't usually pat myself on the back for anything, but I'm really happy to have found the identity of the very first black artist to exhibit at the Birmingham Museum of Art. This is brand new research. I wish I could say that I sat on it until this moment, I'm very active on social media. I let the cat out of the bag on Facebook. I just couldn't help myself. I'm friends with so many curators and museum directors and artists around the country, and I felt like this needed to be acknowledged, that we now know that Cory Mitchell, who was a Birmingham educator, artist, received her teaching degree at Columbia University in New York, was a major figure in the Birmingham art scene, that she was the first African-American artist, male or female, to exhibit at the Birmingham Museum of Art. And she served at that time as the president of the Birmingham Art Club and had a one-woman show at the museum that opened on March 24th of 1963 and was up for just a week. And I was even more pleased to be able to find a photograph of Miss Mitchell. This is a very recent discovery, and I will say I have lots of research left to do. I am hoping to find people in Birmingham that knew her and can talk to me about her life and her work, and hopefully find some examples of her artwork. Because in our registrar's files at the museum we have just this checklist but no images, so I don't know what any of these things look like. So this was, for me as an art historian, as a researcher, this to me was like, you know, winning the lottery, finding this information, because it's been something that I've wanted to know a very long time, and only now, thanks to the beauty of digitized newspapers, was able to discover. The exhibition, by all accounts, was a success. And I will mention this, and this is another area which needs more research. Cory Mitchell spoke at the Birmingham Museum of Art when it was in City Hall in 1957. And so I'm curious to know more about what the museum was like when it was within City Hall, because City Hall, being the offices of the city commissioners who were enforcing Jim Crow laws, that's like going into the belly of the beast, so to speak. And I'm very curious to know more about the context in which Miss Mitchell spoke at the museum in its first location, and also what other black civic groups were meeting at City Hall during that time. This photo I also discovered. This is a photo of the exhibition. It is all of the women from the Birmingham Civic and Fine Arts Association, the leaders of that group, which sponsored the exhibition, standing in the lobby of the Birmingham Museum of Art. This is perhaps the earliest photograph I've ever seen. I did speak to a longtime museum employee who thinks he may know one earlier than this, but this is the earliest that I've seen that depicts black visitors to the Birmingham Museum of Art. It was a huge success, as I mentioned, according to the Birmingham News. And I think I'll call attention. This is Birmingham News. I think I may not need to say it. It was essentially an all-white endeavor. They were slow to publish accurate accounts of what was going on with the civil rights movement, especially when marchers were met with violence from the police. A lot of the photos that their staff photographers took were never published. So I think you get a sense of the kind of the racial bias of the paper when they run a regular feature entitled "What Negroes Are Doing." But nevertheless, it did report on Ms. Mitchell's exhibition and reported that 600 guests turned out for the opening. I look at Bill. As a director, would you say 600 people at an opening is a success? I would too. I would kill for those numbers. So it says to me that there is a real desire among the black community in Birmingham at that time to participate in the arts. And I also think that it was probably not lost on the community what a momentous occasion that was. Ms. Mitchell receiving an exhibition, being the first African American, that was history in the making. On the same day as Ms. Mitchell's exhibition, though, and this is, I think it's important to acknowledge, this was 1963. This was the single most violent year in Birmingham's history. The very same day that 600 people gathered at the Birmingham Museum of Art, the home of a black resident was bombed and utterly destroyed. It caused a crater that extended over 2 blocks, and it injured at least 2 people that we know of. Yet the Birmingham News, the next day, they reported no racial angle to blast, police feel. I'd have to question that. And I think, in fact, in more recent articles by the Birmingham News, in fact, the timeline of the events of 1963, they list that as a racially motivated event. So, which I think, just reading the article, you could come to that conclusion yourself. So this is a timeline of events in Birmingham in 1963. By no means a complete timeline, but an important one to give you a sense of what was going on the very same year that Corietta Mitchell received her exhibition. On March 5th, the city held a mayor-council city election, and this was against the protests of the commissioners. They wanted to remain in power, but this city of Birmingham business leaders were getting fed up. Bad press is bad for business. I wish I could say that their desire to oust the city commissioners was motivated by a sense of racial justice. For a few people, I think it was, but I think that the support of the Birmingham business community was largely motivated by economic interests. Call me skeptical, or cynical rather. On Tuesday, April 2nd, Albert Boutwell defeated Bull Connor in a runoff. On the 17th of April, the newly elected city council transferred all of the authority of the former city commissioners to themselves. Obviously, with the enduring protests of the commissioners who thought that they were still the legitimate government of Birmingham. On April 3rd, Judge J. Edgar Bowen ruled that the newly elected mayor and council are Birmingham's legitimate governor. Well, do you think that stopped a person named Bull? No. He insisted that he was still the legitimate city government and that he was in charge of the police department with disastrous effects. On May 2nd, the Children's March occurred, and Connor, refusing to cede power, ordered the arrest of nearly 1,000 children. On the 23rd of April, though, finally, Bull Connor stood down after the Alabama Supreme Court ruled that Bowen's decision was correct, and that effectively removed Connor and the other commissioners from office. On July 23rd, the Birmingham City Council unanimously repealed all segregation ordinances in the city's general code. That leads us to September 15th, a day that lives in infamy in Birmingham, the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, not just in Birmingham, but around the world. And then finally, the assassination of President JFK on November 22nd. I mean, this was a fraught year, not just in Birmingham, but nationally. But the reason I think it's important to walk through this timeline is think about this. Corietta Mitchell was given an exhibition at the museum a full 4 months before the city's segregation ordinances were repealed. Now, I wish I could say that after the segregation ordinances were repealed, that African American artists were getting exhibitions right and left. That wasn't the case. Things really did not change at the Birmingham Museum of Art for another seven or 8 years, which leads me to question, why was Corietta Mitchell given an exhibition? Certainly, she had the talent and credentials. She was highly regarded from what I've read. She was the president of the Birmingham Art Club. Lesser artists had been given more attention at the museum, certainly deserving of an exhibition, but why at that precise moment? And part of me, and again, this may be the cynic in me, rather than believing, oh, you know, that the museum, you know, Richard Howard had gone to the Haywood Oubre exhibition the year before, and he was ready to embrace black artists and bring them into the fold. Part of me wonders if it wasn't offered as a means of appeasement during a very fraught time. If the museum, which let's not forget, it is a department of the city of Birmingham, it is part of the very government that is oppressing you know, a huge chunk of its population. Part of me wonders if that wasn't offered as you know, kind of a means of kind of cooling the fires of tension, of racial tension in Birmingham, which were really heating up at that precise moment, evident in the fact that there was a bombing the very same day as the exhibition. I haven't yet been able to answer that question. I don't know that I will, but I put it out there by way of speculating. So I mentioned that things started to change in the 1970s, and the first thing that changed were in the realm of acquisitions. Birmingham Museum of Art, as I've already said, was founded in 1951. It took 20 years for the museum to accession the work of an African-American artist. This was not a purchase, it was a gift from a Birmingham woman who had lived in Paris and had met Tanner and bought directly from his studio. And it's a beautiful Henry Ossawa Tanner and Moroccan scene. That was 1971. The following, or that same year though, something happened in Birmingham which I believe had a tremendous impact in City Hall and by extension all departments of the city. That year, Richard Arrington became the first African American elected to the Birmingham City Council. Now previously, the highly regarded civil rights attorney Arthur Shores had served on the city council. He was appointed to a vacant seat in 1968, but Arrington was the first to be elected by the people of Birmingham to serve on the city council. As some of you already know, in 1979 he went on to become the city's first black mayor. He was extremely popular, serving 5 consecutive terms, 20 years before retiring in 1999. So that is what happened the year that the Tanner was accessioned. But the following year, the Birmingham Museum of Art purchased its first work by a living African-American artist, and whose work was purchased? None other than David Driscoll, the very professor who had been turned away at the doors about a little more than a decade earlier. And David Driscoll remembered this purchase. It came at a time that was meaningful to him. When he spoke to the archivist at the Archives of American Art, Smithsonian, did an oral interview back in 2009, he said, I think it was in the 1970s that I began developing a market, not a big market, but a select market for my work. My colleagues bought from me. Museums were not buying. One or two, I shouldn't say museums were not buying. One or two museums did. The Birmingham Museum were among the few, the Bowdoin College Museum, but no major museums. Well, I'll still, you know, I guess we're not a major museum, but still we were buying, even though I was included in one show at the Whitney in 1971. And we have been recently asked to participate in a major David Driscoll exhibition that's being organized by the Colby College Museum of Art up in Waterville, Maine, and we have agreed to lend our Driscoll painting to that show. It's an important work in his oeuvre. And so we're very, very proud to participate. But David Driscoll's name will keep coming up in the remainder of this history. The following, or rather that same year, a couple months later, we purchased this work, Jacob Lawrence's Builders. And I should mention that, if I didn't already, that the purchase of Driscoll's Ghetto Wall #1 was funded by none other than A.G. Gaston, Alabama's first black millionaire, whose building hosted the Haywood Oubre exhibition. We purchased this work, though, later that year by Jacob Lawrence. It remains a cornerstone of our collection of American art, and I'm proud to say, a shameless plug, that in October of this year we'll be hosting a major Jacob Lawrence exhibition, Jacob Lawrence, The American Struggle, which we will take right after it shows at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So save yourself the price of a ticket to New York. You can just drive over to Birmingham and see it on our walls. So things changed remarkably quickly in the 1970s. And this was not only true in Birmingham, but nationally. There started to be a movement which paid more attention to Black arts and a celebration of Black arts. And this is evident in the exhibition history from that time. Beginning in 1971, the museum hosted a series of exhibitions, which it did over the next decade for Black student artists from the state of Alabama. And this always coincided with Black History Month. The idea for Black History Month was first conceived in 1969 and first observed at Kent State University in Ohio in 1970. And it appears from the record that Birmingham joined that movement in '71 with the inception of this exhibition. I won't read off all of the titles. You can do that yourself. I think you can tell a little bit about the changing rhetoric of each year based on some of the language that's used. The exhibition in 1987 gets me Voices in the Wilderness, Naive Art of Black Expressionism in Contemporary Alabama. That's a mouthful. I think that probably is at a time when scholars were trying to reckon with folk art and people who are self-taught, autodidacts, and trying to kind of figure out, well, you know, how do we, naive was a word that was used at that time. We've since banished that word. Our most recent folk art exhibition, we focused on folk artists as makers and called it the original makers. So that's a little bit of kind of museology in there. There are a couple of exhibitions in this mix that were incredibly important to the museum. I also want to add, since we've spoken about Corrietta Mitchell, that Corrietta Mitchell continues to be involved in the Birmingham art scene in the 1970s. And in 1973, she was invited to curate the Afro-American Invitational for the Birmingham Festival of Arts, which was an annual event, arguably the single largest art event in Birmingham every year. In 1973, the country chosen was France. I have yet to find out the content of the Afro-American Invitational, so research is unfolding there, but I thought it was wonderful to see Corrietta Mitchell continue to be involved with the Birmingham art scene into the 70s. David Driscoll makes a reemergence at the Birmingham Museum of Art. He curates a major exhibition on the occasion of the U.S. Bicentennial called Amistad II, Afro-American Art, which came to Birmingham. He also returned to the Birmingham Museum of Art as a guest lecturer in 1981, and speaking on the occasion of Impressions, Expressions, Black American Graphics. And then, as I've already mentioned, came back to the BMA in 2009 when he was honored by our Museum Sankofa Society. So David Driscoll and the Birmingham Museum of Art's destinies seemed intertwined at many different junctures. But of all the exhibitions that occurred during the 70s and 80s, this is the exhibition that by far had the greatest impact on our institution's collecting strategy. This is Sharing Traditions, 5 Black artists, organized by the Smithsonian. It included examples of the work of Joshua Johnson, Robert S. Duncanson, Edmonia Lewis, Edward Mitchell Bannister, and Henry Ossawa Tanner, arguably the 5 most significant historical Black artists working in America. And this provided us with a roadmap for collecting. At the time this exhibition was shown, we had only one work by any of these artists, the Henry Ossawa Tanner Moroccan scene that I've already shown you. When I arrived at the Birmingham Museum of Art in 2006, that was still the case. Of these 5 artists, we had only the Tanner. And so I, really my sort of a self-defined mission for how I wanted to build our collection of American art when I held the title of curator. I set out to acquire major examples of work by each of these artists. The first work I was able to acquire was this work by Robert S. Duncanson, a free man of color working in Cincinnati before and immediately after the Civil War. This is his dream of Italy. And I tell people that if I'm hit by a bus and you're writing my obituary and someone wants to mention my most significant acquisition to date, this is it. So if I get hit by a bus tonight, you're all on notice. So inform the newspaper. This pair of works by Edmonia Luce, Hiawatha and Minnehaha. She did 3 separate compositions which were drawn from Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha, which had additional significance for Edmonia Luce because she identified as both Black and Native American. She was half Ojibwe, or Chippewa, the former name for the nation. We also were able to acquire this work by Edward Mitchell Bannister, who was an artist working in Rhode Island, very influenced by the French Barbizon school. And this was acquired in honor of Norm Davis, one of our current trustees, a longtime collector of African American art with his wife Carnetta. And the Davises have been instrumental in building our collection of African American art. They gave us this major example of the work of Charles Ethan Porter, a Connecticut still life painter, who was a close friend of Mark Twain, who collected his work as well. We have also, we collect all the way up to the present day. We have a very active acquisition program. We have focused on various movements within African American art history. One particular area of interest is the AfriCOBRA group, which stands for Coalition of Black Revolutionary Artists. Well, originally, and then later stood for African Commune of Bad Relevant Artists, AfriCOBRA. This is a great example of Jeff Donaldson's work, Eminence. I mean, it just, what's not to love about this? It just exudes energy. As does this work by Wadsworth Gerald, which is a portrait of one of Birmingham's own, the civil rights leader Angela Davis, who recently spoke at the Birmingham Museum of Art. Well, she gave her keynote address next door at Boutwell Auditorium, but held a meet and greet at the museum, and we had this on view in the same room. We couldn't help ourselves. But it is based on a photo that first appeared in Life magazine, and Angela Davis is actually wearing a outfit that was designed by Wadsworth Gerald's wife, fellow artist Jay Gerald, and it is her revolutionary suit. And instead of bullets across the chest, those are pastels. So artists fight with their materials, not with guns. We've also acquired, as actively as we acquire works by African American artists, we also acquire images of important figures in Black history by non-Black artists. This is a good example by the documentary photographer Yves Arnold, who's a Jewish extraction. And Yves Arnold followed Malcolm X on one of his speaking tours and took many, many photographs of him, which were ultimately published. Forget if it was in Esquire or Life. I think Esquire might have turned them down and Life published them. Don't quote me on that. But this is one of the most iconic of those images. And then this is one that I'm really proud to have acquired. So for the longest time, the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery thought they had the only portrait in oil from life of Dr. George Washington Carver. In fact, there was an earlier portrait in oil by a Birmingham artist named Arthur Leroy Bairnsfather that remained in Birmingham in the artist's daughter's home. And I was tipped off, a fellow curator who had visited the home for another reason, when I arrived in Birmingham, said, I think this Mrs. Lambert has a portrait of George Washington Carver. You're going to want to go see this. And I just immediately fell in love with it. I think it's an extraordinary likeness. It's just, it's a crowd pleaser. We've done a lot of school programs because Carver is one of the historical figures that many children learn about in school. And the work of Emma Amos, who's an artist associated with the Spiral Group. Paul Sapuya, who's a photographer living and working, born in California, but very active today, getting a lot of critical attention these days. This is a self-portrait done entirely with mirrors. He's got a very clever technique. Nick Cave, one of his sound suits, a Chicago-based artist. These are just a handful of recent acquisitions. The work of Mickaleen Thomas, who bedazzles her surfaces to stunning effect. Do what makes you satisfied. A young artist who's really, I think I would call him maybe a couple of years ago emerging, but I think he's now emerged. Wilmer Wilson IV. He's based in D.C. He is a performance artist. He covered himself in stamps and walked to the post office to mail himself. It was his homage to the individual formerly enslaved Henry Box Brown, who mailed himself to freedom. And this is just one of the most magnificent drawings in our entire collection by Toyin Odutola, who's born in Nigeria but raised in Huntsville, Alabama. And this is her portrait of the artist Hank Willis Thomas, whose work we also have in the museum's collection. This is all pen and ink. I mean, unbelievable. And I wish you could, this digital image doesn't do it justice. The technique is just extraordinary and meticulous. And then this brings us to arguably the best known work in our collection, certainly the one that is most often requested for loans these days, Cary James Marshall's School of Beauty, School of Culture. Cary James Marshall is from Birmingham, moved away to California as a juvenile and now makes his home in Chicago, but he has never forgotten his roots in Birmingham, Alabama. We have collected his work in depth for a long time, but the one thing that eluded us till 2012 was a major example of his painted work. We had sculptures, we had photos, but not a major painting. We were fortunate to get this painting, School of Beauty, School of Culture, which is a discussion of black beauty or standards of beauty. And you could see there are all of these black queens in the room, and you can see, underscore the queen, that she's sitting in the Sheba chair. Yet the children are focused on an anamorphic image of Sleeping Beauty. If you turn your head just the right way, it turns into the face of Disney's Princess Aurora, Sleeping Beauty. So it really calls into question the standards of beauty that black children are being presented with, thanks to the Disneyfication of American culture. And there are so many other things I could say about that painting, but that'll have to remain for another talk. This is a recent acquisition about which we're very, very proud. It's the work of Mavis Pusey. You remember Dr. Driscoll mentioning that he was shown at the Whitney in 1971. In that same exhibition was this work by Mavis Pusey. Mavis Pusey was a black woman originally from Jamaica working in New York in the 1960s and 70s. There were more obstacles than doors to her success, and so she got fed up and she left. She moved south. She ended up teaching art at Woodbury, the elite prep school. She was the only black member of its faculty. Until recently, people thought that she had already died. She did actually die just last year, but long before she actually passed, because no one had heard from her in years. People assumed she was already dead. In fact, that was not the case. Our curator of contemporary art, Hallie Ringel, when she was working previously at the Studio Museum in Harlem, tracked down Ms. Pusey, who was in poor health, suffering from dementia, but was able to connect with her and take her to see some of her work on on view. We've been fortunate to acquire a number of works from her incredible body of work, which includes not only paintings but really extraordinary prints. She was inspired by the architectural environment of New York City. And so we will be co-organizing a show with the Studio Museum in Harlem that will open in 2021. And then finally, this recent acquisition by Joe Minter, a Birmingham artist who uses found objects to create environments. This is 63 foot soldiers, so going back to that important year of 1963 in Birmingham. And we were honored to have this work included in the 2019 Whitney Biennial. This was one of the standout works, so nearly any review that you see of that exhibition in the New York Times and other publications mentions this work by Joe Minter. Joe was very, very proud to have it in the exhibition as well. He has worked for a very long time without receiving the recognition he deserves, and thanks to the efforts of Souls Grown Deep in Atlanta and others locally in Birmingham, he's finally starting to get some acknowledgement for his extraordinary artistry. So this brings us, kind of almost to the present day. This is the facade of the museum in 2011, and since I began with the image of the facade, I wanted to kind of wrap up showing the facade. One of the things that we, in order to connect with a broad audience, we're not afraid to try new things. We have to be willing to examine our practices and listen to the community and change accordingly. And the reason I show this is because here's David Driscoll yet again on the side of the museum. In 2010, we decided to have a special gallery designated for the work of African American artists. This was in response to local educators and museum goers who say, I know that you have this great collection of African American art, but where can I find it? And we had always, peppered it throughout the galleries. I think maybe being sensitive to the fact that, the idea of separating black artists from white artists, that, the ghosts of history, that might resonate with the idea of segregation or separation and not wanting to encourage that. And so, but finally, we said, well, maybe we ought to try it because educators and museum goers are asking for one-stop shopping. They really want to see this together. And so this is from the period when we experimented and had a gallery dedicated to African American art. That changed, though, with the arrival of subsequent curators who came from institutions where they integrated, as we had been doing, the work of African American artists with all artists in the collection. And so it's something we're constantly struggling with. One of the things that we have begun doing more often with all the artists is including images of the maker, white or black or Native American or Asian American, or on the label. We haven't done that. We've got 27,000 objects in the collection. 12% of them are on view. We haven't redone all of our labels, but we're constantly thinking about how can we communicate with the public about what we have and what our priorities are. I also think it's important to acknowledge the fact that the leadership of the museum has changed. In 2011, 60 years after the museum's founding, the museum elected its first African American board chair, Judge Ralph Cook. He served 8 years on the board, 4 as the chair. We acquired this wonderful Benny Andrews in his honor. I'm proud to say that presently, I went through the process of seating a board last fall, which has to have city council approval. I'm proud to say that at this present moment, the museum has one of the most diverse boards in its history, both in terms of gender, race, talent, age. It is a remarkable group of individuals, and is starting to feel more representative of the city it serves. I think that, in the interest of full disclosure, we've got a long ways to go. I think that maybe the museum will have fully achieved a sense of inclusion when the person standing up here representing the Birmingham Museum of Art is not a white man. And I don't wish myself out of a job, but there will come a time when either I retire or move on, and there will be an opportunity for someone else. And so maybe that person will look different than I do. That said, we're always trying to think about ways that we can connect with the community. I would just want to point out a recent success. We have a popular series called Art After 5. It's the first Friday of every month. It's free, and it's a theme night, and it's kind of game night. There are tours, there are guest mixologists, we have film screenings, we've done Big Lebowski night, we did Harry Potter night. Well, we recently did a night in Wakanda. It set the all-time attendance record, drawing 1,097 participants, 8 participants more than Harry Potter night. Black Panther beats Harry Potter. I feel like there's a spell for that. And then finally, I will end on this. It began with the facade. This is a photograph from a recent article written by Erica Wright for the Birmingham Times. The Birmingham Times is a Black-owned and operated newspaper in Birmingham. Has been around for many years. For years, the Birmingham Times rarely covered what was going on at the museum. And there would be a mention here or there, but not serious coverage. That has changed so much in recent years. I think as we have embraced the community and shown that the community that the museum belongs to them, and we convey that through a message of art free for all. This is everyone's museum. This museum has no barriers to admission. We have seen the community embrace us. This article by Erica Wright was the cover story of the Birmingham Times, and that issue included not one but 5 separate articles about the museum, something which had never occurred before. So we're not resting on our laurels, though. This is my research is a work in progress. Our embrace of the community we serve is a work in progress, and so we just strive to do more and better every day. And with that, I thank you for your attention. I spoke a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I think we have time for a few questions if people have them. Yes, sir.
Could you reference, throughout your beginning of your talk, you referenced different newspapers, and being someone not real familiar with Birmingham, were they all like the general white newspapers, or were they black, or some context of that?
I think in every case, except when I mentioned the Birmingham News, which was a white-owned and operated newspaper, all of the other newspapers that I mentioned that were covering the black art scene were black-owned and operated newspapers. There was the Afro-American in Baltimore. There was, I think, the Huntsville Mirror. So most of what I found, and thank goodness these are all being digitized right now, the best coverage of the black art scene, not surprisingly, was in the black-owned and operated newspapers. The Birmingham News, to a limited extent. I was actually pleasantly surprised to find the photo of Ms. Mitchell included in the Birmingham News. Though the photo of the large group of women from the club that organized the exhibition was, I believe that was from Huntsville, from a black-owned and operated newspaper. Thank you. Yes?
I was a little confused about the timeline when Cory and Mitchell couldn't exhibit there. Was there ever a time when an African American had their work exhibited there where they couldn't actually go there?
Not that I'm aware of, because she was the first, well, let me put it this way. The week that she exhibited, according to the ordinance in place at that time, And the exhibition, they broke with ordinance. The exhibition, I believe, opened on a Sunday, not Tuesday. So it opened on a Sunday. But in theory, that week, because the ordinances hadn't been repealed, blacks would have only been allowed to visit that exhibition on Tuesdays. What is not clear to me is whether, because it was clear that the rule of the city commissioners was crumbling at that point, whether the leadership of the museum started exercising some form of civil disobedience and breaking rank. I can't prove that. You already heard me speculate that perhaps this was meant as a means of appeasement, so maybe it was with full city knowledge that they were kind of bending the rules, but maybe for some ulterior motive. It wasn't then until the 70s then that African American artists were given, 1 or 2 person exhibitions, and so by that point the ordinances had been repealed, and so they couldn't participate. Where I do know this happened though was at the Birmingham Public Library. There was an interview given by Eleanor Bridges, who was a figure in the Birmingham art scene, and she was an interview conducted, I think, by, I want to say it was by CBS News, and it was a program called Who Speaks for Birmingham. You can see the tape of this on continuous loop at the Civil Rights Institute in Birmingham, and she describes a UNICEF children's art exhibition at the Birmingham Public Library, and the winner of the contest, unbeknownst to the organizers, was a black child. And the parents and the child wanted to come see the exhibition. He was the prize winner, but they were not allowed to enter the library. It was it was the main branch. It was an all-white library. And so Eleanor Bridges describes in this, she's like, oh, well, it was no trouble. I just simply made a call and arranged. She just kind of treated it so nonchalantly, it was lost on her that maybe there's something morally wrong about not allowing a child and his parents to go into a public library. And so she just sort of, in this interview, I'll never forget it, she's wearing this massive hat and sitting in front of a bird cage at the club, a private club in Birmingham. You have to see it, but that is one example of what you just asked about, where someone was denied admission initially to see their own work of art. Maybe 1 or 2 more questions? Yes?
Yeah, thanks so much for speaking to us today. I had a question about, well, sort of 2 related questions. I was at the museum for the first time a few weeks ago looking for Edmonia Lewis and found her upstairs in the Native American galleries. I wondered what the reception of placing her work there has been, and also how you feel the current approach to, again, integrating these historical African American works within the rest of the collection. Has that been successful compared to the experiment you were talking about a few years ago?
Both good questions. So with respect to the Edmonia Lewises, so I advocated for the purchase of those works when I was curator, paid for them with funds earmarked for American art. They immediately went into the Native American Gallery, which was, I think, initially intended just to kind of share the wealth, and we thought, well, no one's really telling this part of Edmonia Lewis's history. It's so focused on her identity as a black woman, but she is also a Native American woman, and we are collecting I hope you saw when we were in Birmingham, we're collecting contemporary Native American work, but we never really collected anything that kind of could exist in 2 worlds quite the way that those works could. Also, the subject matter is Native American, Minnehaha and Hiawatha. I think the reception, it's hard to say. I think from scholars and regular museum visitors, it's sort of like, where's your Edmonia Lewis? Wait, I'm in the American Gallery. Where is she? I know you've got one. And then they're surprised to see it upstairs in our Native American Gallery. Eventually, I don't think that will be the case. What we are talking about doing right now is doing a fully integrated Gallery of the Americas. It's in the conversation stage, but we have great pre-Columbian holdings, great Native American holdings, and great American pre-war holdings, and we've thought about what if we brought them all into kind of one run of American history, similar to what the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has tried to do. Regarding integrating them in the collection, I think that, again, it's hard to know unless people tell us, and I never want to say, oh, well, we haven't heard a thing, so people must be happy with that. Silence doesn't mean approval, as you know. But there has, I think, because we show so much work now by African American artists, I think that no one has said, where can I find it? I can't find it now that it's integrated in the regular galleries. In fact, we did a special 2-year exhibition of our contemporary collection. It was called Third Space, curated by Wesson Al-Khaderi, who's since moved on to St. Louis to their contemporary museum as chief curator. In that exhibition, which was 2 years and it had rotations, of these couple hundred artists whose work was shown in that exhibition, I think that maybe 5 were white. So we were predominantly showing the work of non-white artists in that exhibition, not just from the United States, but global contemporary art. So I think it might boil down to a numbers game that our collection of the work of African American artists, especially in the contemporary realm, is getting so rich. In the historical American department, though, even when we had a special gallery dedicated to African American art, we continued to show works by Tanner, Duncanson, etc., Romare Beard and Jacob Lawrence in our American gallery. So we didn't denude the galleries of that work. We just included other examples in the dedicated gallery. Does that answer your question? Okay. All right, well, thank you. Oh, there was one more. All right, last word.
So if you had a silent auction and there was a African American artist, the Real Love Child, and he had artwork at Christie's recently, and then in South Georgia at the Albany Museum of Art, he had a piece in a silent auction that he didn't even know was in there. So somebody must have just donated it for the silent auction. Now, the Albany Museum of Art is trying to become a regional museum, and we have a African American collection. Do you think the purchasing of a silent auction item would be smart if this artist, if we just had it just appeared, the artist didn't know it was here, but we're representing a 78% African American community in Albany, Georgia. Do you think the museum is smart by purchasing it?
Well, I mean, I guess we could talk some more after. It's hard for me to answer that without knowing specifics, but I think that when you're building a collection, as long as things are done ethically, as long as the work was acquired from the artist and then donated to a silent auction ethically. A lot of times artists don't know where their work turns up, because once they release it into the world, it is, especially in this country, they lose tabs on it. It's different in Europe, where they have moral law, where an artist maintains a certain amount of control over the legacy of their work, and also can benefit at auction from the sale of their work during their lifetime in certain situations. Here we don't have that system. So I would say, when it comes to building your holdings of African American art, or any art for that matter, seize opportunities where you find them. As long as you're operating ethically and legally, I don't see any problem with acquiring works from a silent auction. In fact, there are works that have been donated to the Birmingham Museum of Art that I'm certain were originally acquired at silent auctions, benefiting other nonprofits in Birmingham. So I hope that answers your question. We could talk more afterwards. So thank you all for having me here today. Thank you for your time.